Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another top 10 player video based around a specific point in Survivor history, where in the past I've done a top 10 players before Survivor All-Stars, I've done one after Micronesia, and after Heroes vs. Villains, where this one will be another time jump, where here we'll be ranking the top 10 players before Survivor Cambodia, which is probably the penultimate stop for this video series. Again, these are just to examine how I feel like I would be ranking players based on landmark times in Survivor history, where, again, I did feel like before Cambodia was, again, the next benchmark from where we left off, where obviously it's in between the two full returnee seasons, essentially the entire 20s of Survivor, point where you do get a good chunk of really strong players during that time frame, to where, again, I felt like this was the next benchmark to stop off at, especially considering Cambodia itself causes a few changes to the list, and obviously beyond that we get the final steps to what my player ranking ended up being by the time I did the actual formal player ranking video for the first time, to where I feel like this is a good place to stop. Before we get to the top 10, we'll go through the honorable mentions. First, talking about the people that were on the previous list, though did end up getting knocked off over time, along with players that played within this time frame that did not make it onto the list. So let's talk about the players that got kicked off the list. First up, we have Russell, where, again, immediately after Heroes vs. Villains, we would have had him having two back-to-back finalist appearances, where, again, that was very impressive. However, in time since, obviously, again, there are more players, but also the fact that we do see him return for Redemption Island, which doesn't go great, which, to be fair, I don't really dock him too much for, considering at the end of the day, again, he was pretty screwed coming that season anyway, but still, again, he was barely on the top 10 last time, to where now with so many more players added, again, he did not make the top 10. Also, Sandra is now out of the top 10, which, again, obviously people call me insane for this take. Yeah, I never found either of Sandra's wins particularly impressive. While, again, she does win 2 times, that is something to definitely give her a lot of credit for. I do feel like her 2 wins are both relatively weak wins in the show's history. Both wins where she's playing inoptimally for a lot of the game and ends up getting through it despite that, to where, again, I felt like for me, by the time we get some of the really impressive wins that end up occurring during this time frame, I feel like she would easily be kicked off the top 10 for me personally by this point in Survivor history. Another person that got kicked off the top 10 ends up being Amanda Kimmel, who does not play in this time frame. Again, last time we did see her with Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, and her being kicked off the list here is kind of a ramification of, at this current point, most of the people that do make up the top 10 are winning players. There's only one non-winning player on that list, so again, it just kind of makes it tough for you to be a non-winner and still make the top 10, to where, again, Amanda, at this point, I would still look at somewhat highly, just, again, not enough to crack the top 10. And the last person that, again, was on the original list, but now not, that person is Todd Herzog. And it's tough with Todd at this point. We had only seen him play one time. I think because that we just have a lot less proof with his game, and we don't really see much versatility from his game, to where, while, again, he would still definitely be in contention for this list. To be honest, like, I would not be shocked if he's genuinely number 11 at this current time. It was just, again, not enough to quite make the top 10. But again, those are the players that were on the last top 10 list. Now let's talk about the players that played in this time yet did not crack the top 10. Starting it off with the only Nicaragua player in contention, which was Chase Rice, who, again, as I said, at this current point in Survivor history, it's very tough to make the top 10 without being a winner. And while Chase, again, I think plays one of the best runner-up games, someone that was in the majority alliance the entire game, had a decent amount of win equity if Fabio didn't win now, and again, even then gets a 5-4 vote. Again, it is very impressive. However, at the end of the day, still not the highest rated player, to where I think his game is probably better than what I think of him as a player in the grand scheme of things. So for me, despite how impressive his game was, he was never particularly close to making it on. From South Pacific, we do have a couple considerations here. Obviously, the returning players from this season. We get more to look into. Again, we got Ozzy, who plays once again, comes very close to winning this season, though, again, for me, it wasn't a particularly impressive game. It was a game where he gets voted out, has to come back through Redemption Island, and again, just in general, the entire format of this season greatly benefited him, to where, again, I didn't find it to be an overly impressive game, to where, while, again, it does show him having the ability to almost win a jury vote, it's still not one that, again, would have really propelled him too much on my player ranking. However, someone that would jump up a lot on my player ranking would be Coach. And again, after Heroes vs. Villains, Coach was pretty much a joke. I don't think anyone really took Coach seriously. No one really looked at him as a competent player. However, obviously, South Pacific really changed that. Again, South Pacific was such an impressive appearance from Coach. He really just dominates the season from beginning to end in a way that I think just no one genuinely thought was possible. Though, where, again, Coach would definitely jump up quite a bit on the player ranking, but realistically, I don't know how high. Where again, even in comparison to the last list, I don't even know if he's higher than Russell. I think he's probably around that spot to where, considering that, again, he just simply did not make the top 10. Also from South Pacific, someone I did consider was obviously the winner of the season, and Sophie, who, again, I very much debated this. I don't think at this current point I would be particularly confident in her to have her as a top 10 player. I mean, I remember at the time of Survivor Cambodia that I don't feel like I was particularly high on Sophie back then. I mean, obviously on my eventual top 10 list, I did have Sophie on there. But however, that was obviously after Winners at War. And to be fair, my opinion of Sophie went up over time to where, again, I do not feel like my opinion of Sophie was particularly high at this point. And mixing out the fact that, again, like her winning game was definitely very rocky, definitely some pretty poor social play at points, definitely some wonky journey management, to where while I do think she is definitely a competent player, I don't feel like she would be that close to the top 10. Now for One World, where, I mean, really no one here was in consideration. Obviously, we do have a major person who makes the top 10, but outside of that, no one was truly in contention. I mean, Chelsea and Sabrina were both people that, again, probably the best players of the season outside of the person that made the top 10, yet even then, they weren't particularly close. Again, just tough to make it on the list without being a winner of the show. Next, moving on to Philippines, where obviously I very much to consider Denise. Where, again, Denise is a player that, while my opinion of their winning game has significantly gone down over time, I do feel like she's still a player that demonstrated this ability to play from the top and bottom. And while, again, playing from the top, I don't feel like she was really playing. As, again, I do think Malcolm did a lot more to legwork at that point. I do think she still does good work from the bottom. And, again, I do think Denise is definitely a player that I would look at somewhat highly at this point. Yeah, again, I don't feel like she was particularly close to the top 10. I would think that at this point, I would kind of look at her as a similar player to Sandra, which again is just not enough to end up making it on the list. And for Kara Moen, and again, for Kara Moen, obviously none of the newbies were in consideration, though there were some returning players here that would have ended up being in consideration at this point, where I do think like the likes of Andrea and Brenda would have been contention for a best to never win list. Yeah, again, would not make it on the formal top 10. Malcolm obviously has his two best seasons back to back at this point, to where I remember at this point I was particularly high on Malcolm. I think in retrospect, I'm probably a bit lower on it, but even then, again, at best, he's pretty much tied with Amanda, who again did not make the top 10, so again, he would not make the top 10 either. I also got Dawn, who I think plays a very impressive game in Kara Moen. Yeah, still, again, out of this season, I don't feel like she comes off as good enough to be in the top 10, particularly with her lacking win equity, and obviously we do got considered a winner in Cochran. Yeah, I just think Cochran is a player that I just think is extremely high variance. I don't think Cochran's a very consistent player to where, while again, I think his winning game is very impressive, I don't know if he's able to do that on most seasons, to where, again, he did not make the top 10. Next up for Blood versus Water, where really the only newbie that was in contention here was Hayden, to where, again, I think Hayden ends up playing a very impressive game, though still has some holes there, but considering the backing of knowing how he played on Big Brother, I do feel like he would have been, again, somewhat in contention here, definitely in the conversation of best non-winning one-time players, but again, not enough to make the actual top 10. After that, you got some returning players that boosted their legacies. Obviously, Tina ends up having a somewhat impressive run in this season. Again, kind of questionable game, but still comes very close to winning this season. I think that's something to at least give her credit for, but again, at the end of the day, I would, again, have her around the spot where I have Sandra, to where, again, she's not enough to make the top 10. And again, while I do think my opinion on the likes of Monica Culpepper and Jervis would have gone up through this season, it also would not be enough to make the top 10. Next up for Survivor Cagayan, and really the only consideration here would have been Tony. And again, it's actually an interesting spot in Survivor history for Tony, where at this point we had only seen him play one time, to which he won, and it was a very impressive win, yet also a very hectic win, to where, considering the fact that we did not see him return for Game Changers yet, which probably sunk his reputation a bit more, I feel like my opinion of him after Cagayan was, again, kind of high, yet I just don't feel like it would have been high enough to be in the top 10. I do think I would have still looked at him as a pretty highly variant player, to where, while I think he probably would have been closer to top 10 than what he's going to be when I do my final video in this series that takes Game Changers into account, I do feel like Tony, again, still felt like a high variance player, to where I don't think he ever would have actually cracked the top 10. Now for Samuel Desir, I mean, obviously there's someone that is very highly regarded that does crack the top 10. Yet of those that don't, I mean, obviously we later see good appearances from Kelly Wentworth and Jeremy, where obviously this is right before their two breakout performances, yet again, at this current point, not anywhere in contention to be in the top 10. The final person we'll talk about from worlds apart here is Mike, where, again, I think there's at least an argument for Mike, where while obviously he had to win out from pretty far back, I do feel like Mike's game is kind of an all-arounder. Again, it shows him playing a dominant game at the beginning. It shows him initially building some good social connections and also obviously dominating in challenges and fighting an idol, where, again, I think he does show himself to be a pretty well-rounded player across this season. Yeah, I think he at least makes enough mistakes here to where I think it's tough to justify putting him in the top 10. But with that, let's get into the top 10 itself, where obviously a decent amount of these people are the same people as in the previous list. Though obviously placements change, some of these people played again in that time, to where my opinion on them as a player changed, and just in general, we do got a pretty different list here. We're starting off with one of the changes. At number 10, a new player for this list, despite the fact that this person had played 2 times. By the time of my previous list, yeah, at number 10, we do have Tyson Apostol, where obviously this is coming off of his win in Blood vs. Water. And again, I do think at this current point, I would have been pretty high on Tyson. For a while, we later saw him in Winners at War, and he had a bit of a questionable appearance there. I do feel like this is probably the height of my opinion of Tyson, where while again, obviously we saw his first 2 runs, which weren't particularly great. Again, I think his first one you could justify from the fact that he didn't know Survivor at that point and didn't know what he was doing. And the second time, I think you can justify that by saying that while he made a very dumb move, you can at least see where he's coming from. Now he's trying to gain this social capital with Russell. Yeah, obviously it just completely backfires on him. And even outside that, again, was in a pretty powerful position in the game, a very likely winner if he does not get sniped down in that position, where, again, considering he does come back in Blood vs. Water and ends up dominating that season, again, I would be pretty high on Tyson, especially considering also, at this current point, I probably looked at Tyson as one of the best Survivor strategists, where I think something that gets kind of lost now, I don't hear many people talk about it, but I think Tyson is probably one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to Survivor strategy, where I remember, like, at the time, his appearances on RJP, he would do once a season, where he would actually be able to break down the strategy extremely well. So I was always impressed with the way that Tyson analyzed the game, even before he ended up returning for the win, to where I do feel like Tyson is someone that I would have a lot of faith strategically at this current point in Survivor, and that's why I had a lot of faith in him coming into Winners at War, which obviously ended up being unfounded. But again, I would be pretty high on Tyson at this point, but obviously considering his first 2 appearances, which were not great, I think it'd be tough to put him much higher on this list. But again, considering his very dominant final performance, again, I do feel like it'd be enough to crack the top 10 at this current point in Survivor. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that is also new for this list, someone that is a very recent winner at the time of this list, and that person is Natalie Anderson from San Juan del Sur. And at the time, I really loved Natalie Anderson. I mean, Natalie Anderson's game in San Juan del Sur was so impressive to me, to where while I obviously qualm with the fact that obviously she was blindsided at the Jeremy vote and she was willing to take Jeremy to the end where she was going to lose, I still feel like everything she does after Jeremy goes home is extremely impressive, to where she has some of the most dynamic gameplay in that end game stretch, which is just so interesting to see. Again, her saving John just to keep him around as a shield and systematically weakening his power structure around him and then flipping the vote onto him at final 6, taking off an idol, and then we have the Baylor move. Again, there's so much impressive about Natalie Anderson's game in San Juan del Sur, where, again, I would have her in very high regard at this point. Again, I think her San Juan del Sur game, again, has some of the best individual moves from a winner. That, again, is just so impressive, to where, again, I had a lot of faith in her coming into Winners at War, which also was not particularly founded. There, again, I do think this single appearance from San Juan del Sur really would have shown a lot of depth in her game. Again, the fact that she, again, has these very impressive moves, but also is able to recover from adversity. And the fact that she is blindsided by the Jeremy vote and somehow still finds herself in that majority alliance immediately following that, I think is pretty insane. To where, again, I do think Natalie's game is really impressive on this specific season, which is why she's here at number 9. Now, number 8, and now we're getting to a stretch of the list which is mostly the same. I mean, this is essentially a recreation of my previous list, especially the higher end of that list, where obviously those people end up dropping due to the appearance of 2 new people at the top of the list. But again, we'll still be running through this portion of the list. At number 8, we do have Yul Kwon from, at this point, only Cook Islands. As again, I think Yul's game in Cook Islands is a very impressive one. I think it's one where, while again, he was definitely benefited by the Super Idol, I think he was able to utilize the Super Idol to the best of his ability. And beyond that was also, again, the leader of a dominant alliance that ran the game. Now, again, I do think he was benefited by certain production decisions, but still, I do think Yul played a very impressive game. I would have looked at him as one of the best strategists in the history of the show at this point, and in general would have a lot of faith in his overall game ability. For in general, I've always been pretty high on Yul as a player, even though, again, his winning game is a bit rocky to me. But so again, I think at this current point, Yul still still above the likes of Natalie and Tyson, where I think he plays a more consistent game than Natalie Anderson, who obviously loses control at a point, and obviously doesn't have the checkered history that Tyson has, to where I do think for a one-time player, I think I would have looked at Yul pretty highly, considering Yul, again, also faces adversity and the fact that he comes into the merge down in numbers and is able to work it to his favor. I think Yul does end up showing a lot of layers to him as a player, and also literally had layers that we had not fully seen yet, considering, again, in Cook Islands, it did seem like he was kind of watered down by him being worried about how he's going to be perceived and wanting to make himself look like a good role model, and through that, I think we didn't get as much of a cutthroat nature from Yul than he could have potentially had. Again, I think for all those reasons, again, I would still have Yul in pretty high regard at this point, so that's why he's here number 8. Now, number 7, again, keeping with the same list as last time, we do have Tom Westman. Now, again, obviously Tom hasn't played since the time period of the last video yet. I do feel like at this current point, the luster of Tom Westman probably would have worn off a bit, to where obviously the time that I previously did the video on was immediately after Heroes vs. Villains, where I do think you would be pretty high on Tom after Heroes vs. Villains. Obviously, he just had a somewhat impressive underdog run, at least pulling off the Cirie move, where, and I do think I would be looking at him pretty highly now. Again, obviously this is seasons later, and again, I debated putting him lower, yet I do think actually at this specific point, I still probably did have him in pretty high regard, where obviously now you see my winner rankings, and again, I have him in the bottom sub tier of my top tier, when back then, I think I probably had him near the top of the list. I think there was definitely a point where I had Tom at like top 5 winners of all time, which I think is kind of insane to look back on now, but again, I do think I still would have had Tom in somewhat high regard at this current point, where I think at this point, again, he would have showed himself playing decently well from the bottom, like he did in Heroes vs. Villains, while also playing, again, at that time, I assumed good from the top in Palau, where, again, I think he still showed himself to be a pretty decent all-around player. That's why he's number 7. Now, number 6, again, same person as last time, we do have Earl from Fiji. Now, truth be told, I consider dropping Earl, where, again, I kind of struggled with the overall context of this list of, is it supposed to be using my current view of these people, but still basing around these people's careers at the time, or should I be basing it on what I actually thought at the time? As straight up, me thinking of Earl as this like really top tier winner is a more recent thought for me, where obviously I had him already in my top of the top tier by the time of my first winner ranking in 2019. Yet I feel like that was an opinion that really grew somewhat recently at that point, to where I do think at the time of Cambodia itself, I probably would have had Earl as like a bottom top tier winner, with me not really understanding how much control he really had, especially over someone like a Yao Man, where again, I think this was a bit of a debate in that sense, to where, again, if I'm assessing on how I look at Earl now, I do think this is a fair assessment. However, I'm looking at this as how I looked at Earl at the time of Cambodia, then Earl probably should be a few spots lower, debatably out of the top 10. Yeah, again, I decided to still keep it around how I currently viewed the game, especially considering that's how I did the previous list without really taking that into consideration. Where, again, I did feel like Earl, again, played a very impressive game. While I do think there are definitely factors on this season that would not be there on many other seasons, I think he showed a level of adaptability to his game that's very impressive, especially in the fact that he didn't know Survivor and wasn't a fan of the show, where considering that fact, and also, again, him from the have-not tribe and overcoming that, I do feel like there's, again, him overcoming a lot of adversity, also demonstrating himself as a very savvy, strategic, and social player. So I think there's a lot to like here from Earl, which is why he's here number 6. Now, number 5, moving on to a player that, again, has not played since the last time I did the video yet. Will play very soon, which is what ends up affecting their final placement on my list nowadays. Yeah, where while, and really they're in the same spot on this list and my final list, I do think my opinion of their game was not as high as it is now, and that player is Cirie. Where obviously at this point, the last time we saw her was in Heroes vs. Villains, where she had 2 very impressive runs in Panama and Micronesia, both being truly elite games for those that did not go on to win. While she had a pretty lackluster game in Heroes vs. Villains, yet not entirely bad. I mean, considering her placement, obviously she needed to be idled out. She had a good chunk of allies, but again, that's still the last appearance that we had from her. For again, considering this is 10 seasons later, no real update, I do wonder if my opinion of Cirie would have been a bit lower at this current point, to where, again, this is obviously a less finalized version of Cirie, where, again, modern Cirie, I think we can justify as this, like, truly elite player after we see her come back with a massive reputation, a big target on her back in Game Changers, and being able to recover from this initial target and play a pretty impressive game by the end of it, and being obviously sniped out by Advantage Get In, where I do think by the time of Game Changers, I think we could solidify her as a truly elite player, where I feel like at this point, she's still a very good player. Yeah, again, it's kind of why she isn't above these next two people that, again, she would be above in the modern day. Where obviously, again, this is a version of Cirie that we have one less season's worth of content from. And through that, again, I think we are missing a bit of consistency, where I think that was definitely a major thing I thought about Cirie at this current point, was that I didn't think Cirie was a particularly consistent player. I did feel like Cirie would be an early boot a decent chunk of times that she plays, which is not an opinion that really holds anymore. Where, again, in retrospect, I mean, obviously we see her make deep runs her first two times, and while she's definitely in danger early on in Panama, again, she overcomes that. And we see her, again, being in a spot where she should have been an early boot in Heroes of Villains, yet also is able to overcome that. Though, again, I know at this current point, I did look at her as someone that, if she were to play again, I expect her to be an early boot again. Again, considering that ends up being upended by the time of Game Changers, again, that would have elevated her a bit more. Yet at this current point, I feel like it's tough to justify putting her much higher, as again, she's already the top non-winning player. She's the only non-winning player in the top 10, which is a distinction that she still holds to this day. Again, I feel like without the win and without this extra season to fully solidify her longevity on most given seasons, I do feel like she still has a stick behind here, number 5. Now, number 4, now moving on to another player that had not played since Heroes of Villains. So obviously, that was a very rocky run for them. Yeah, I do think I would have had them in decently high regard still at this point. That person is JT Thomas from Survivor Heroes of Villains. And obviously, again, this is before Game Changers. So through that, again, he's still somewhat high here. I think after Game Changers, he would drop a decent chunk on this list, especially below Cirie, where, and the reason why he's above Cirie right now, I think, is kind of a fundamental thing. Again, JT's the one that directly outplays Cirie in Heroes of Villains, while also having a win that is also very impressive. Where, again, while I'm a bit lower on it now, at the time, I remember I thought of JT as a similar winner to the likes of Kim and the likes of Boston Rob, as this like truly elite winner that ran the game from beginning to end. And while, again, I don't think that's true now, again, that was definitely my perception at the time. Where, again, I do think I looked at JT extremely highly at the time. And again, without the context of Game Changers, I do think he is still a very impressive player. Again, having a win, having the most win equity on the board, and still being able to get to the end without needing to win challenges until the tail end of that season. While also, again, Heroes of Villains, while people criticize, obviously, him giving away the letter and him giving away the idol to Russell, which is obviously a really bad move, I do think he still pulls off some pretty impressive things on that season. Again, he organizes blindside against Cirie. He's able to reassimilate himself in the majority alliance, and had the heroes gotten the numbers post-merge, I think JT's in a very strong spot at that point. So while I do think the likes of Amanda and Candace were very sus of him at that point, I still think he has the likes of Rupert and Colby pretty locked in, to where, again, I think JT should have a pretty easy road to another finals appearance, to where, again, he likely wins again, to where, again, considering the impressiveness of his first win, and his second was not too far away from him being a 2-time winner, and again, me not feeling like his move to give up the idol is as bad as people say, considering other context around the season. Again, I do feel like JT is someone that I still would have held in pretty high regard at this point, to where that's why he's here number 4. And now number 3, and now we're getting to finally a change on the list. Again, a change that, again, would have been pretty apparent after this person went on to win the season, where it is funny how this person obviously was someone I talked about in previous top 10 videos in the past. Yeah, obviously at this point, his reputation would have fully solidified. And at number 3, I do a Boston Rob, where obviously this is the first time we're doing a list after Redemption Island, and obviously Redemption Island was just such a masterclass, an appearance from him, of him running the show from beginning to end with very little difficulty, that really ends up excelling him on a player ranking, where, again, I think after All Stars, I would have held him in pretty high regard. And while I don't think his appearance in Heroes of Villains did much to detract from his overall game, I do feel like it's still one where, by that point, there are just other people that have better reputations than him. With, again, him still being a non-winner, him only having one really good performance out of 3, which is not a good stat. However, again, I think now, after Redemption Island, it's a more impressive run here. I mean, Redemption Island, again, a masterclass in gameplay, him running a show from beginning to end, while his strategy is one that isn't particularly adaptable. We've now seen it work 2 times. And even in the 2 times it didn't work, we saw some very impressive play from those 2 seasons. Where, again, I think in Heroes of Villains, he gets very unlucky at the Tyson vote and how all that plays out. While in Marquesas, again, I think his strategy was effective at first, only for him to just be down in numbers due to him losing challenges, which, I mean, to be fair, is a ramification of his gameplay style. But still, I do feel like his 2 bad appearances aren't even that bad, while he obviously has 2 extremely dominant performances, with one of them being a win that also has him learning from his original experience. And again, like Tyson, I think at this current point, I would look at Rob as one of the best strategists in the history of the show. Someone that just genuinely gets the strategy of Survivor. Where you hear any podcast with him, and you just tell that he gets it. He understands people and social strategy, to where while there's obviously a lot of criticism over time about how he's too stagnant of a player and one that utilizes strategies that aren't effective anymore, I think he even recognizes that. And again, I think the way that he talks about the game is in a way that it just shows a full understanding of the game. And I think that is something that would also prop him up for me. And the fact that, again, I think I would just have so much faith in his strategic ability, considering he's now had 2 really strong appearances, getting to the finals twice, while also winning. I feel like it's tough to not have him towards the top of the list. So where while there definitely are still qualms with him as a player, again, I think at this point he would be held in particularly high regard, which is why he's here number 3. Now, number 2, we're really going on to this big debate for me at this current point in Survivor history, where the top 2 are 2 players I still hold as 2 of the best players of all time. Yet this is an interesting spot for them, where one, we have the player that was number 1 on my previous list, which is a player that has now had 3 appearances on the show, all 3 being pretty decent, with obviously one of them being a win, and obviously showed the ability to get to the end again despite a massive target on their back, which is a very impressive aspect of them as a player, while we have another player that plays one of the most dominant games ever played. To where while that we only saw them at one time, just the sheer impressiveness of that one win would be enough to have them in really high regard. And again, it's a bit of a tough debate between these 2, specifically at this point in Survivor history. Yet at number 2, I am going to go with Parvati. Parvati, again, is tough here, as obviously she's the most careered of this top 2. Again, she is the person that has 3 appearances, made it deep every single time, won a season, came in second on her following season. Again, it's a very impressive track record, where at this point I believe she also had the record for highest average out of 3-time players. So where again, there's a lot of resume here for Parvati. However, again, I always struggle with the assessment of Parvati as a player, as I do feel like there's an aspect of her that's a bit overrated. I do feel like Parvati, while having 2 very impressive runs, also has 2 impressive runs that demonstrate a lot of flaws in her overall play. And the fact that I think she's too loyal to certain people. I think the fact that she also treats some people particularly poorly. And again, considering to talk about how great of a social player Parvati is, I do feel like she's always demonstrated flaws as a social player. So while she is very good at building bonds with specific people, it never really branches out to everyone on her cast, which is something that I think we saw with the number 1 person. Where while we did see obviously Parvati play from the bottom for a lot of Heroes vs. Villains and overcome that, which again is impressive, and obviously adds to the depth of her as a player, I do still feel like, again, I have more things to nitpick with Parvati as a player, especially at this current point, to where I think it would be close. Again, I do think the lack of as much game to really take in consideration for the number 1 person is something that, again, could have led to Parvati still being number 1 here. Yeah, I think the sheer impressiveness of the number 1 player's game is, again, enough for me to have them at number 1 at that point, even though, again, I think Parvati would have been pretty close just due to, again, how much we know Parvati as a player. Yeah, I just feel like the number 1 person was a bit more impressive to me, which is why I have Parvati here at number 2. Now, number 1, a new number 1 on this list, where, again, I genuinely do think at this current point, I would have this person as the number 1 player of all time. I do feel like I remembered even at the time that I looked at this person as potentially the best player of all time, and that person is Kim Spradlin, where obviously this is just coming off of her appearance on One World, where she obviously dominated the game in an unprecedented fashion, not just having the level of control that Boston Rob had throughout a lot of his game, but also having the win equity and having pretty much everyone on the cast adoring her, where outside of Leaf and Troyzan, again, every other member of the jury was someone that she had particularly strong bonds with by the end of that season, where really the only person she was not able to bond with on that season is Leaf. So again, considering she was able to connect with almost her entire cast, again, I think that's a very impressive aspect of Kim on this season, where, again, looking at the likes of Parvati, who definitely had a lot of enemies, Boston Rob had a lot of enemies, I think you're really going back to JT's run in Tokensheens to have one of these top players that was able to get through their season with most of the cast wanting to work with you and still rooting for you to win. Where, again, I think that's something that's very impressive about Kim as a player, to where obviously the qualms are the fact that we only saw her play once, and we never really saw her play from the bottom. Again, she was in a spot where she was in a good position the entire time. And again, that is what makes it a bit tough to really assess Kim, in the sense that it is, again, a lot less on her resume over the likes of Parvati, to where we have a full grasp on Parvati's strengths and weaknesses as a player, while I feel like with Kim, we see a lot of her strengths, but we don't really see much of her weaknesses, simply just due to the lack of proof for her game. Where, again, at the end of the day, I think it's extremely close between the two. I remember even at the time, there were points where I had Parvati number 1, there's points where I had Kim number 1. I do think I would waver between the two. Yeah, again, for this specific list, I do think I would lean Kim. Where again, if I'm looking at the way I currently view the show, I just feel like Parvati has too many faults for me personally to have her as the number one player at this current point. To where while we have Kim, who again, while we haven't seen as much of her, again, just has no real faults in her as a player. To where I just think the sheer dominance of Kim on One World, not just in, again, how much she was able to control the action of that season, but also, again, her masterful positioning in the game, and also, again, her really high jury prospects are, again, just kind of unrivaled by anyone on the list at this current point. For a while, again, I think Parvati would have been someone that would be very easy to justify as the number one player after Here's Villains. I do think after 10 more seasons and having these very impressive wins from the likes of Kim and Boston Rob, I think it makes this a lot more competitive for this number one slot. To where, again, I just think I look at Parvati as a bit of a flawed player, too much so to have her in the number one spot over Kim, which is why I do have Kim here at number one. But there we go. I mean, that's my top 10 players before Survivor Cambodia. Now, again, as I said, I have one more part in this series coming up at some point where I'll be doing my top 10 players before Winners at War, which, again, will be the final step in the lead up to what eventually became my top 10 players, which I did immediately after Winners at War, to where obviously Winners at War itself did cause a lot of changes to the list. There are obviously being additions and modifications to the list. Within the span of the 30s of Survivor, I did feel like it was worth it to do one more video in this series, so stay tuned for that for whenever it comes. And obviously in general, just expect the same type of content from the channel, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.